Good afternoon. My name is Karen Dace, and I am the Associate Vice President for Diversity at the University of Utah. We are pleased to have you join us for the keynote address in honor of our 23rd annual celebration of the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. This year, the Planning Committee selected as its theme Civil Rights Postponed in response to the growing resistance to social justice in America and the development of new laws, practices, rules, and regulations designed to silence dissent, end discussion, close borders, and kill dreams and opportunities for marginalized peoples. We began the week with a panel discussion featuring University of Utah professors of education, political science, and history titled Treading Water, which examined recent setbacks in voting rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues, and immigration. Last night, Issa Davis, the niece of our keynote speaker, along with University of Utah students and community members, presented Angela's Mixtape, a coming-of-age performance which involved learning about oneself while developing a growing appreciation and understanding of one's parents and a very famous aunt. In addition to this afternoon's keynote address by Dr. Angela Davis, we hope you will join us at 3 p.m. on Friday, January 12th, in the Saltaire Room of this building for a lecture by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, the author of the critically acclaimed Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and current president of Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Tatum will address contemporary issues in race relations in the U.S. Also on Friday at 7 p.m. in the Union Theater, we present American Blackout, a documentary examining the historic and systemic disenfranchisement of the African American vote through the lens of the political career of former Georgia Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. At 8:30 p.m. on Friday, KUED Channel 7 features an interview with Angela Davis on the Utah Now program. In 2004, in recognition of our 24th anniversary of Martin Luther King celebrations, the Planning Committee initiated a community service project as part of the week-long event. Recognizing healthcare disparities and the overrepresentation of people of color with life-threatening illnesses, including diabetes, we will provide a diabetes awareness community service project in conjunction with Intermountain Healthcare. A number of community organizations have teamed with us to provide this free 4-hour health fair for diabetes awareness information, screenings, and referrals. The service project will be held this coming Saturday, January 13th, at the Northwest Multipurpose Center, 1300 West, 300 South, and again, that is free. As is our tradition, we conclude our activities with the awarding of the Martin Luther King Youth Leadership Awards and a cultural performance featuring Guapale. 19 Utah middle and senior high school students who are actively involved in social justice efforts in their schools and in their communities will be recognized prior to the performance of Guapale, a singer and songwriter known for her social and political activism. This event begins at 6:30 p.m. at Libby Gardner Hall on Monday, January 15th. As always, all University of Utah Martin Luther King events are free and open to the public. The cultural event on Monday, January 15th is free, but does require tickets for admission, and they may be obtained at the Kingsbury Hall box office. We provide these programs each year with the hope that we will begin the new year reflecting on the life and legacy of a great leader who was killed for his efforts to bring equality to all of this country's citizens. As Dr. Enrique Alaman so eloquently noted during yesterday's panel discussion, Reverend King was a patriot, although many did not view him in this way nearly 39 years ago when he was assassinated. As the committee planned this year's activities, it was painfully aware that many who question policies and practices today continue to be accused of being unpatriotic. We are struck by the realization that we are at once a nation that claims to celebrate the contributions of Dr. King, while at the same time work to destroy much of what he gave his life to achieve. To this end, we offer a panel discussion, film presentation, performances, award ceremonies for those who continue to strive for social justice in an increasingly hostile climate, and today's keynote lecture, in hopes that none of us will remain silent or immobile in the face of injustice. It has never been popular to speak up and out, but it has always been a necessity. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. David Pershing, who will more formally welcome you to the University of Utah. He will be followed by Sally Valdez, Diversity Coordinator in the College of Nursing, who will introduce today's keynote speaker. Thank you.
I would like to add my formal welcome to all of you who are here today on behalf of President Young and my partner, Senior Vice President Loris Betts, who's here with me. It is wonderful to see so many people here. You are the face of what the University of Utah is today and even more of what it will be in the future. And it's great to have you here. There's some of you I know that are actually middle school and high school students, and I want to especially welcome you. We hope that you will not only enjoy today and certainly learn from it, but also come back when you're ready to be university students. This is a great place to go to school. As Karen said, this is our 23rd annual celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and these events have become a very important part of our campus life, particularly at this time of the year, and we're excited to have such an outstanding program this year. I want to welcome all the faculty and staff who've taken time away from their busy schedules to come and be with us today. We're really glad you're here, and I think you will definitely be rewarded. I'm also pleased to see so many of our University of Utah students here today. You are why we're all here, and I believe that what Dr. King has taught us is as important today as it was in his era. And I think you're going to hear that in several different ways throughout the celebration. One of my favorite quotes, actually, from Dr. King is something he said directly at faculty and at college students many years ago, and I would like to read that. Quote, "We must remember that intelligence alone is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of a true education. The complete education gives one not only the power of concentration, but worthy objectives on which to concentrate. The broad education will therefore transmit to one not only the accumulated knowledge of our race, but also the accumulated experience of social living." End quote. Finally, I want to especially welcome all of those of you who are community members who've come today to hear our speaker and to participate in our activities. It is our hope that you will have an excellent time on our campus, that you will enjoy other parts of our program, of this celebration, and that you will come back many other times. We are truly Utah's university, and we want you to feel welcome whenever you come onto our campus. And finally, I want to add my personal welcome to Professor Davis. She has had a horrendous travel schedule to get here, and I think it shows how committed she is to this work. For me, it's a personal pleasure to have her here and to meet her and welcome her again. She and I are actually contemporaries, although you wouldn't know that by looking. She looks a lot younger than I do. I conclude that's because of her calm, idyllic life that she does. When I was the age of you students, I can very well remember the kinds of challenges that we were having in that era and her leading out. And so it is a huge honor for us to have her back on our campus at the University of Utah. Without further ado, I'll invite Sally Valdez to come up and formally introduce her. Thank you.
My name is Sally Valdez, and I'm with the College of Nursing. I feel very honored and privileged to introduce Dr. Angela Davis. But I first would like to tell you about Dr. Davis. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in the midst of Jim Crow laws. Her father was a graduate of St. Augustine's College, a traditional black college in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was briefly a high school history teacher, but he left teaching due to the low salary. He owned and operated a service station in the black section of Birmingham. Her mother, also a college graduate, was an elementary school teacher, and she had a history of political activism. Using their modest income, the family purchased a large home in a mixed neighborhood called Dynamite Hill. This was marked by racial conflict, and that was why it was called that. She occasionally was able to spend some time on her uncle's farm and with friends in New York City. Her brother, Ben Davis, played defensive back for Cleveland Browns and Detroit Lions in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Through her activism and her scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the large public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender equality. Professor Davis' teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, the Claremont College, and Stanford University. She has spent the last 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is a professor of history of consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and a professor of feminist studies. Angela Davis is an author of 8 books, and she has lectured throughout the United States, as well as Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, South America, and also the Soviet Union. In her recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that were most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. She also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent books are Abolition, Democracy, Beyond Empire, Prison and Torture, and also Are Prisons Obsolete? She's now completing another book on prisons and American history. Angela Davis is a member of the executive board of the Women of Color Resource Center in the San Francisco Bay Area, an organization that emphasizes popular education of and about women who live in conditions of poverty. She also works with Justice Now, which provides legal assistance to women in prison and engages in advocacy for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant strategic for addressing social problems. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, a similar organization based in Queensland, Australia. Like many other educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system. Having helped to popularize the notion of prison industrial complex, she now urges audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Former California Governor Ronald Reagan once vowed that Angela Davis would never teach in the University of California system. Today, she is a tenured professor in the History of Consciousness Department at the University Santa Cruz. Professor Davis not only talks the talk, but she walks the walk. And now please welcome Professor Dr. Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be back in Salt Lake City. I really enjoyed my last visit here in the spring of 2001, I believe. I spoke in this very same hall during Women's Week. And I was extremely happy to receive the invitation to participate in this year's Martin Luther King celebration. So first, let me thank Sally Valdez for the wonderful introduction. And I appreciate the fact that she did some research and included information about my father and brother that's seldom included in introductions. It sort of reminded me that I really walk in my parents' footsteps. And I'd also like to thank Karen Days, who is the Associate Vice President for Diversity here, for having been responsible for organizing such a rich celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Day, for having invited me to deliver the keynote, for having invited my niece, Issa. Actually, her first name is Angela as well, but she prefers to use Issa. Identity issues here. But she did her performance, Angela's mixtape, last night, and I think a number of you were here, and I've seen it. It's really wonderful and funny and embarrassing, especially for me and my sister, to see how she experienced growing up with us. And I'd like to thank David Pershing, the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, for welcoming us and reminding me that it is important to be aware of generational issues and to strive for intergenerational communication. Now, oh yeah, there's one other thing I wanted to do, because I was so surprised when I discovered that my niece Issa would be performing, but also that Guapole would be performing, whom I've known since she was a child. And all of this was quite serendipitous. So I would urge you to go out and hear her. She's absolutely incredible. I've sort of watched her hone her craft since she was very, very young, and I'm totally impressed by what she is doing today. I want to talk, first of all, about this moment that we are celebrating. As most of you know, Dr. Martin Luther King the day that we have chosen to celebrate his legacy, January 15th, hasn't always been with us. As a matter of fact, it was not until 1983 that Martin Luther King Day was declared a holiday. And that marked the culmination of 15 years of advocacy and mass campaigns for this holiday. And so I would like us to remember that we are able to create this temporary community today precisely because so many people in the past fought to establish a day on which to observe his legacy. Congressman John Conyers first introduced legislation for a commemorative holiday 4 days after Dr. King was assassinated. 4 days after Dr. King was assassinated. And every subsequent year, between 1968 and 1983, he, along with Representative Shirley Chisholm, reintroduced the legislation. And there were also rallies and marches, and Stevie Wonder wrote his wonderful song, Happy Birthday. I would like us to take a moment and remember that all of this activity, all of this determination, all of these struggles enable this moment that we celebrate today. And I know that here at the University of Utah, you've been observing Martin Luther King Day for 23 years. And that actually preceded the legislature's decision to designate a state holiday, rather. Utah was a holdout, right? Utah and Arizona said, I don't care, the rest of the country can celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King, but not us. But the University of Utah was in the vanguard. So thank you. Let's see, we have another half an hour or so. How long do we have until about 1? And I would really like to save some time for some exchange. So let me see if I can rush through my notes. I'm really not known for being succinct, but I will try. And first I'd like to say that I'm really happy to learn that the theme of this year's celebration is civil rights postponed. Not that I'm happy that civil rights have been postponed, but rather that you're using this occasion to reflect not only on what was achieved by the historic civil rights movement, but you're also acknowledging the fact that we are not now living the dream of Dr. King, that we cannot celebrate the triumph of racial equality and racial justice. And that what we celebrate is the continued struggle for equality and justice. And I would like us to remember that that dominant official legacies of what is considered to be the triumph over historical scars, slavery, the genocide of Native Americans, segregation. These legacies are created by declaring that the offending set of practices over which we have triumphed are dead. And so there's been this narrative of triumph that has been spun. And I'm thinking about the fact that Rosa Parks' legacy was declared to be sufficiently American to allow her body to lie in state in the vestibule of the Capitol, the first woman who was accorded that honor in the history of the United States. Now, I'm glad that that happened, but I also want us to be critical of the way in which her legacy was represented. The civil rights movement, in a sense, had to be assumed to be dead in order for its legacies that have been individualized in the figures of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Coretta Scott King, in order for them to be incorporated into a narrative of what we might call an unbroken struggle for American democracy. And I mention this because democracy is a word that is used in many ways these days. When some people say democracy, I hide. And when democracy is assumed to be that which is being exported to other parts of the world by the use of violence and war, that is not the democracy I want to be associated with. And so I'm happy that we're here today to reflect upon what is required in order to move this country in the direction of justice and equality, democracy. At a time when many of the political leaders in this country, and now, unfortunately, the majority of the Supreme Court justices, argue that racial justice has been achieved and therefore affirmative action is no longer necessary. Gender justice has been achieved and therefore affirmative action is no longer necessary. It is really important to think about the meanings of these terms. It might be important for us this afternoon to reflect very specifically on the extent to which the principle of color blindness has so saturated our ideas about race that we tend to believe, and especially those who voted to eliminate affirmative action in California and then in the state of Washington and most recently in the state of Michigan, who believe that the only way to achieve racial justice is to become blind to the work that race does. Which also means that racism itself gets ignored. And so I would like us to think a bit deeply about the various ways in which we are influenced by this racism toward which we are encouraged to adopt a posture of colorblindness. Toni Morrison has written a wonderful essay, and it's called The House of Race. And I would like us to ask, where does race live? Where does racism live? Where did it reside in the past? And how do we shrink the spaces that are currently haunted by racism in order, hopefully, eventually to send it on its way to oblivion? Where does racism go? Where does it hide? To what extent has the war on terror and the current war in Iraq transformed salient manifestations of racism? And why do we have trouble perceiving this racism? According to our historical narratives, the first important step in the achievement of racial justice in this country was the abolition of slavery. And of course, we know that slavery was perhaps partially abolished with the Emancipation Proclamation. Not all the population of slaves were freed by the Emancipation Population. Let me see if I can get my words right here. And as a matter of fact, those states that remained loyal to the Union that held slaves were allowed to keep their slaves. So that tells you something about the intent of the Emancipation Proclamation. But then, of course, there was the 13th Amendment. And we assume that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery once and for all. Now most people have become conscious of that clause in the 13th Amendment that creates an exception namely those who have been convicted of a crime. And so you might argue, many people argue that to this day, people in prison are to a certain extent what Judge Ruffin called in an 1871 decision, slaves of the state. But I want us to go further. I want us to go further. And I want us to ask what it was that the 13th Amendment abolished. Do we ever ask ourselves how the 13th Amendment defines slavery? Is slavery as simple as a word? A woman, a legal scholar by the name of Gayora Bender, wrote a really wonderful piece called The Slavery of Emancipation. And there she asked what those features were that the 13th Amendment had in mind when it proposed to abolish slavery and involuntary servitude. She asked, was it slavery as human property? Was it compulsory labor? Was it corporal punishment, which was so much a part of slavery? Was it non-citizenship, which was so much a part of slavery? Was it the social death of slavery? That is to say, slaves were socially dead, civilly dead, not acknowledged by the law? Was it the racism that enabled slavery that was supposed to be abolished by the 13th Amendment? Well, you can see that we could continue to talk about the various ingredients of slavery and ask whether a simple proclamation and an amendment to the Constitution could abolish all of that. If slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, would it have taken 100 years for black people in the South some black people in the South to achieve the right to vote? Because not, as we know, not all black people. As a matter of fact, if all black people had achieved the right to vote, the current president would probably not be in Washington today. The point that I'm making today is that actually we still live with the vestiges of slavery. In the South, all over the country, including in Utah, because there was slavery here in this state as well. I mean, it's really interesting to see so many black people here this afternoon. But I also wonder, in terms of the black people who have historical roots in this state, to what extent their roots reach back to slavery in Utah. I was actually going to talk to you a bit about my own experience growing up with the vestiges of slavery in Birmingham, Alabama. And Sally Valdez, pointed out that I grew up in a place that was called Dynamite Hill, and that was because every time black people bought houses in that neighborhood, they would get blown up or burned down by the Ku Klux Klan. And I was going to talk about how I learned the protocol of racism when I was a child. And how my parents tried not to allow that protocol to be normalized. And so, my mother used to say, this may be the way things are now, but this is not the way they're supposed to be. And she used to tell me over and over again, remember, this is not the way they are supposed to be. And one day, things will change, and you'll look back on this moment, and you'll recognize how important it was to have fought for change. And so, one of the things I do now when I go back to my hometown is I can't help remembering what things used to be like and what's changed. And there have been wonderful changes, amazing changes. But then at the same time, I recognize that there are forms of racism that I perceive today that were not so evident 50 years ago or 60 years ago, and I guess I'm telling my age now, Sally. So, and it seems to me that we assume that there was a period during which racism was overt in this country, when there were laws governing segregation, when there were forms of segregation that permeated every aspect of civil society in the South. And now those laws have been abolished. But there are forms of racism that I think we are perhaps reluctant to perceive. One of the things I remember is that growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, there were jobs available to black people, primarily black men, in, for example, the steel mills and the iron ore mines. Birmingham used to be a major steel center. And as a matter of fact, the history of working in the mines and working in the mills came from a history of convict leasing that followed slavery. So the black convicts were the first to do that work. I don't have time to go into all of the details of that history, but I want to point out that now you go back to Birmingham, there is not a single steel mill, working steel mill in the entire city. And that has to do with the deindustrialization of the economy. That has to do with the globalization of capital. And that makes us think about the extent to which international developments inform the way racism manifests itself locally and domestically. And so now there is even more poverty than there was when I was growing up. And now there are so many more black people in Alabama behind bars than I could have ever begun to imagine 30, 40, 50 years ago. But we have learned to be colorblind. We've learned not to notice racism because we've been persuaded that the only way to eliminate racism is to pretend that race does not exist. Therefore, on a college campus, we do not necessarily notice the dearth of black and Latino and Native American students. If we enter a prison, it is not necessarily evident that we encounter a situation that is exactly the inverse of what we encounter on college and university campuses. That is to say, people of color have a much greater likelihood to go to prison than they do to go to a college or university. And so I ask why we cannot see the damage that structural racism, institutional racism is doing to our society. Racism that does not call itself racism, racism that is not necessarily bolstered by explicit laws of segregation. Why can we not see the damage that these racist policies are doing to the world? Racist policies including the decision to invade Iraq and to destroy an entire country, to destroy an entire culture. The emergence of what we now call a prison industrial complex that has global ramifications was enabled by the fact that race matters a great deal in determining who gets to go to prison and who receives racially motivated reprieves. Now, I want to point out that the forms of racism that we recognize, the forms of racism in the past, were not disestablished because presidents and legislators and judges one day had epiphanies about the injustices and immoralities of racial segregation. It was disestablished because ordinary people, like all of us here, became collectively aware of themselves as potential agents of social change. They became aware of the extent to which they held within their collective hands the power to create a new world. And this is what we celebrate when we observe the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is important for us not to assume that he alone, as an individual, was responsible for the civil rights movement. To a certain extent, we have this Messiah complex. We assume that change happens only because heroic individuals emerge and they lead the masses to freedom. And one of the things that I have always so much appreciated about Dr. Martin Luther King was that he understood his relation to community. And he was not under the illusion that he was responsible for all of the earth-shaking changes that happened during that period. He acknowledged the fact that that movement, which he was called upon to lead, was actually a movement started by women. By women whom we don't often acknowledge. By women whose names we don't even know. And I always like to evoke the name of Joanne Robinson because she wrote a book called The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. And she tells that story. She tells the story of the decision on several occasions to organize for a boycott. And it didn't quite work until Rosa Parks, who was also an activist and not just a tired woman, and certainly not a tired old woman. She was actually quite young. She was an activist. She was a skilled, trained activist when she made that decision not to move to the back of the bus. And women like Joanne Robinson understood that that was the moment, that they could seize that moment. She, along with some of her students at Alabama State College in Montgomery, then stayed up all night long mimeographing, and most of you all don't even know what that means, because you're used to the new technologies. Mimeographing leaflets, it meant that they had to cut a stencil and then turn the drum, right? And they literally stayed up all night and mimeographed thousands and thousands of leaflets and distributed them the next morning at 5 o'clock when all of the domestic workers were on their way to their jobs. And that's how that movement started. And as a matter of fact, Dr. King came to be the figurehead for that movement because the women realized, first of all, it was a black movement, so the leader was going to have to be a minister, right? Who else? But they also realized that there was a lot of competition among the prominent ministers in Montgomery. So that you couldn't ask this one because that one would be upset. And so they said, oh, there's this young man. What's his name? He just finished seminary, and he just arrived in Montgomery, and we could ask him because he won't provoke, all of that conflict and dissension. And so this is how Dr. Martin Luther King was invited to take the leadership of that movement. And I think that's an important lesson to remember, because oftentimes we have difficulty imagining ourselves in these heroic figures. But we can imagine ourselves as doing the work that alone can build movements that will bring about change. And I think that's the real message of Dr. King's legacy. And that is the message I would like us to go away with today. One final thing. I did want to say a few words about the notion of diversity. And I think it's really amazing that here at the University of Utah, there is so much work being done around diversity. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take all of this literature back to my campus, where we've had problems establishing ethnic studies programs and campaigns for diversity. And UC Santa Cruz has a long, very progressive legacy and reputation, but it tends to live on its reputation rather than living in the present and in the future. But I also would like us to be critical about that notion of diversity that circulates. And of course, you've heard from Karen Dace that the definition of diversity here is forward-looking. It's about justice. It's about equality. It's about creating opportunities for marginalized people. It's not simply about difference for the sake of difference. And I'd like us to be critical about the way we use that term, because that term has colonized so much of what we used to be able to talk about with much greater specificity. And so now, when you want to talk about issues affecting communities of color, African American communities, Native American communities, Asian American communities, Arab American communities, Latino communities, you use the word diversity. When you want to talk about gender issues, you use the word diversity. When you want to talk about issues of sexuality, issues related to LGBT communities, you use the word diversity. That's too much, for one word. I mean, it's important for us to make the connections, and there are connections. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we're using this term not primarily to talk about difference for its own sake. We're using it to talk about justice. And I say that because there's a lot of diversity in this country now. There's a lot of diversity that I really do not like at all. You can say that the U.S. government is more diverse than it has ever been in the entire history of this country. And of course, Bush goes to other countries and hails the diversity of the country and the diversity of his government, because he's accompanied by Condoleezza Rice, and as a matter of fact, the Assistant Secretary of State is a black woman, the Attorney General is a Latino man, and I mean, it would be okay if they were committed to racial progress, if they were committed to justice and equality. So it's possible to have diversity and the same old, same old. so you know how I describe that kind of diversity is difference that doesn't make a difference, right? So we want difference that will really, truly make a difference. We want difference that does not promote a hidden individualization of problems and solutions that ought to be collective. And if you notice the ways in which people like Condoleezza Rice evoke the past, they always do it as individuals. They always talk about their individual triumphs. Now, one of the things I noticed was that I could talk about my childhood in very much the same way that Condoleezza Rice talks about hers, because we come from the same place. We grew up in the same community, the same town, had some of the same friends. And we could narrate it in the same way. But what happens is that at the conclusion of her narrative, she talks about how she has triumphed over all of that. Because look at where she is today. I mean, I could do the same because I have a, pretty comfortable life. I hold a professorship at the University of California, and I'm doing things that I didn't imagine I would be doing when I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, that's for sure, But at the same time, I cannot see this as a triumph, because I look at the fact that of the 2.2 million people who are behind bars, almost half of them are black. 70% of them are people of color. How can I claim triumph? And so what we need to do, it seems to me, is to learn how to think community, to think collectively. To think about programs such as affirmative action not as ways to allow individuals to get ahead, but as strategies to push communities, push entire communities. And that is why you can't take the story of someone who is a white man who says he's been discriminated against as having equal weight to with the story of, say, a Native American woman who claims discrimination as well. Because the white man, and I'm not, suggesting that we can't be attentive to the needs of individuals, we should, but white men have historically had all of those privileges. And acknowledgement of privilege is as important as acknowledgement of discrimination. And so let me conclude. I actually had a lot more I wanted to share with you today. I wanted to say a little bit about Assata Shakur, and I urge you to find out about this woman who is celebrating her 60th birthday this year. And recently the FBI Joint Task Force on Terrorism established a $1 million reward for anyone who goes to Cuba and brings her back. She's been living in Cuba since 1986, I believe. She was an activist during the period in which I was an activist. And I'm involved in a campaign called Hands Off Assata to make it safe for her to return. And I urge, all of you, go online, look up the website, Hands Off Assata, find out about other political prisoners. I wanted to talk about Mumia Abu-Jamal and the death penalty. And I wanted to talk about Leonard Peltier, the Native American political prisoner who's been in prison for well over 3 decades. This is my way of recognizing that I have not triumphed. right? I could just as easily be there. And I would definitely be behind bars had not it been for the fact that people all over the country, all over the world joined in the campaign for my freedom. So my final message is quite simple. It's a plea. Please get involved. Please try to make a difference. Please try to turn this country around. Thank you very much. Okay, I think there's time for a few questions.
I was wondering if you might speak. Thanks for your visit here. I was wondering if you might speak a little bit about how the use of imprisonment of blacks in the United States and the use of disenfranchisement of felons is actually, in many ways, used to eliminate the ability of black people in the United States to participate in the voting system.
Well, what I would say in answer to that question is that this is a case in which civil rights have truly been postponed. In many other parts of the world, people who are prisoners are able to vote. Why do we assume that when someone goes to jail or prison, it is okay to divest them of all of their civil rights, including the right to vote? You know, why do we treat people who are sent to jail or prison as as a sort of homogeneous mass? It doesn't matter. If you go to jail for trying to provide food for your children, you don't get to vote. I should say that I was most recently in New Orleans to celebrate Human Rights Day in December, and I learned about the case of a 73-year-old black woman who had evacuated during Katrina from New Orleans with her 80-year-old disabled husband. She was driving, she parked her car in the parking lot of a motel in Kenner, Louisiana, not too far from New Orleans, and was taking things from the trunk into their room when she was arrested by the police. And they told her that a deli nearby had been looted and she had food with her. And so she was put in jail. And she was sent to the women's prison and was not able to get out until January on $50,000 bail. And charges were not dropped until many, many months later. I'd actually rather be the gadfly. But I think you're absolutely right to raise these issues of felony disenfranchisement and the extent to which they result in what we might call the civil death of millions of people in this country, because it's not only those who are currently in prison, but those who get out. In some states, there is permanent felony disenfranchisement. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I said that Bush never would have been, well, he wasn't elected the first time. I mean, let's remember. But there would not have been enough votes on his behalf to even create the issue that sent the decision to the Supreme Court if people who were living in the free world, who had once been in prison, and that is to say about 1/3 of all black men eligible to vote in the state of Florida, if they had been able to vote, we would not be in this mess now. I think there's a microphone approaching you.
I wonder if you could tell me something about your thoughts about this continuum that everybody experiences, and I'm experience of tolerance goes to normalization, goes to sanctioning. I see it in all sorts of, like, social dilemma.
Okay, give me an example, because I understand the conceptual framework you're establishing, but I'd like to give me just one example.
Here in Salt Lake, we're having a big debate about the Mexican border and about illegal aliens. And I worked in the firefighting and healthcare industry, so I know that a lot of things would stop if it weren't for that labor force that we have going for us. But I see this movement, it's like a thought process where people start with not questioning and then
Let me see if I can add another conceptual framework to the way you've proposed it, because I think it's a really important issue, and specifically around this issue of immigrant rights. It seems to me that in the history of this country, community or nation, as we might call it, has been consolidated by identifying an enemy. There's always an enemy that provides the reason for the rest of the community to come together. That enemy was black people, Native Americans, criminals, terrorists, and what are called, quote, illegal aliens. I really don't use that term. The term I used is undocumented people. And, perhaps not even immigrants, because everybody in this country, with the exception of indigenous people, have an immigrant history. And, how is it that it is even possible to talk about building fences along the border? One of the things that we should be aware of, I was talking about the extent to which the globalization of capital has an impact on local racisms. If you think about the fact that we live in what is called an era of globalization, everything moves rapidly across borders. Information moves instantaneously across borders. Capital, money is transmitted across borders. And then when you talk about people who want to join that movement, right? They are told that they cannot cross borders, particularly in situations where the crossing of borders by capital has created economic situations in their home countries that make it really difficult for them to continue to survive there. So the conditions, the social economic conditions for immigration have been created by transnational corporations. And then we say that people who only want to have a better life, that is the only reason people come to this country, because this country represents itself as the land of opportunity. And then it's just really, really upsetting to me. And one of the things I would like to say is that the new civil rights movement in this country is civil rights for undocumented immigrants. That is the civil rights movement. That is the civil rights movement that Dr. King would join, and that is the civil rights movement that all of us should join, regardless of our racial or ethnic background. And thank you very much for raising that issue.
Dr. Davis, thank you for a beautiful presentation. I am a student in Weber State, originally from the Kingdom of Lesotho, which is an enclave of South Africa. I thought I should steal some time from your presentation and share news about a caliber of racism at Weber State University. And I'll use just a few sentences to explain to you what it looks like. The International Students Office that accommodates all students from all countries all over the world. But there's a certain class of students who will disappear from that university because their status is jeopardized. And what happens when the status of the students is jeopardized, the students just decided to disappear. Some of them are roaming around here, they are illegal, others have gone to Canada. And we do have a few like me who are still standing here illegally, not on our code, but we are here also to seek the liberties of the people who live in this country. Again, thank you very much for your support and coming here for the celebration of Martin Luther King.
And thank you. Thank you. And I think it's really important for students, especially in this country, to recognize the extent to which we are encouraged to adopt provincial attitudes. We're encouraged to think of ourselves as the only people who really matter in the world. And sometimes radical activists feel the same way, which means that we can't learn from people from other parts of the world, especially from the global south. So I really appreciate the point that you made. Thank you very much. Okay, how many? One more? One more question. And the microphone is finding the person who's going to ask that question.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Davis. A couple of years ago, we had a speaker at the law school at this university, and I'm forgetting his name, but I believe it may have been Professor Robert Kennedy, who spoke about Randall Kennedy. Thank you.
Randall Kennedy,
yes,
yeah.
Who spoke about Loving v. Virginia and made the comparison with marriage fairness and equality with gay and lesbian individuals in this country. And there were members of the audience who called him to task for making comparison between black civil rights movement and the gay civil rights movement, saying that the black civil rights movement was propelled by and supported by ministers and the religious community. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the ways in which religious communities utilize and fight for and against the civil rights of other people with whom they may not agree. Thank you.
Okay, that's a really important question, I suppose, especially here in Utah. Right, but it's an important question, particularly in light of the fact that I earlier invoked the notion that it is assumed in black communities that ministers provide leadership. And as you know, during the campaign around marriage rights for gays and lesbians, there were outspoken black ministers who participated in the civil rights movement who did everything they could to disassociate the civil rights movement from the marriage rights movement. Now, I like to use a comment that June Jordan once made, the wonderful poet June Jordan, who said justice is indivisible. It is not possible to decide who becomes the recipient of justice and who does not. And therefore, I am really ashamed to be associated with those ministers who would take such a backward position today. But it is important to know that in many communities, black ministers are very much involved in LGBT issues. In the state of Kentucky, for example, there's been this long-term, quite amazing alliance between black community activists and gay community activists. And as a matter of fact, they've won a number of local laws And it's quite remarkable. I always say that it's important to look at grassroots struggles, to see, how it has been possible to solve these huge issues on the ground. But at the same time, I would have to say that, I was trained in critical theory, and I say not only by my mentors, but also by my parents. I've always been trained to question, to think critically about everything, including that which we take for granted. And so I also have to say that that I'm a bit disturbed that so much of the energy of the fight for gay and lesbian equality has been focused on issues like marriage and issues like equality in the military. Because marriage, and I'm not talking about individual relationships, because people create wonderful relationships regardless of their gender. I'm talking about the economic meaning of marriage. I'm talking about the extent to which marriage is an institution that is patriarchal, that has always been governed by the assumption that it is the male who is responsible. I was talking about civil death of prisoners. Well, women historically have suffered civil death through marriage. And as a matter of fact, we still see the vestiges of that with the loss of the name, right? Because the loss of the name meant that the woman could no longer represent herself before the law. She was, in fact, dead before the law. And so, therefore, I think that we have to consider, all of these issues. Now, it's also true that there are a lot of benefits to marriage, economic benefits as well. But I think we have to look at the whole picture. We also have to recognize the extent to which black people have been persecuted by this notion of marriage as a patriarchal institution. George Bush thinks that the answer to problems in black community is marriage, right? So there's a marriage campaign. That if black women only got married, then poverty would be solved, then people wouldn't go to prison, and so forth. So I think it's really important for us to see that whole complex of issues. But I thank you very much for raising that question, and I thank all of you for your attention. And have a wonderful Martin Luther King Jr. 23rd annual celebration here at the University of Utah.